Welcome. This edition of The Light Breaks Through. I am your host, Keith Haney. We live in a world where at times, the negativity and hopelessness around us keeps us in a dark place. This podcast is designed to shine light on the truth in the darkness. The focus will be on racial healing. To do that, I want to introduce knowledgeable guests to address specific issues in the Black community that most people are not aware of or don't completely understand. Only truth breaks through the darkness. We will tackle tough topics and issues with truth and hopefully optimism. Racism is rooted in an ignorance, I think. We fear what we don't understand. We react based on that fear. It evolves into a huge problem. We simply don't know or understand why people don't do the things that we do the way we do them. Take the time and make the effort to understand about other cultures, customs, and also make the effort not to just place a stereotype on any group based on one experience or incident. Today, my guest is Rev Greg Manning, and we're going to talk about what's going on in New Orleans and look at race from what's happening kind of in the Deep South today. Reverend Manning is a facilitator for the Coalition Against Death Alley, which focuses on mitigation and effects of climate change and ending poisoning of predominantly African-American communities in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Pastor Manning also is a co-moderator for Justice and Beyond, that 4-point platform to address systemic racism within our health system, criminal justice system, educational system, and economic development of people of color. He is also pastor of Broadmoor Community Church in New Orleans, Louisiana. Thank you, Greg, for being my guest. We're looking forward to having this conversation.
It's good to be here with you, Keith. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So I'm gonna give you a nice question to kind of ease you into this deep discussion on race. What's the best advice you've ever gotten?
You know, the best advice I think I've ever gotten was stimulated from an incident when I was 13 years old. My biological father had just gotten married to my stepmother, who is Caucasian, and we were going to the grocery store. I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and they had gone into the store, and I was tired. I said, "Can I just sit here in the car?" And they said, "Sure." I really didn't feel like going in the store. And they went in, and I'm sitting in the backseat of the car. And all of a sudden, there's two guys and a young child next to me that I noticed. And I noticed them, Keith, because they started yelling out. The adult male started yelling out, "I have a dream. I have a dream." N-words laying everywhere with bullet holes through their heads. "I have a dream." And just going,
oh my goodness.
I was terrified. I'm sitting in the back seat, starting to just crouch down in my seat and just heart racing. And he just keeps going on and on. And then he says to the kid, there's a toddler in the back. Kid must have not been more than 4 years old. He says, "Call him the N-word, call him the N-word." He's saying the actual word, "Call him the N-word." And the kid starts saying it. I'm terrified. And I'm thinking, okay, I can't wait till my dad and my stepmom get out of the store. So my dad comes out, and my dad's big, built like a football player. Was a football player in high school. I said, "Dad," I said, "these guys next to me were yelling and saying this." And he looked at me, he looked at them, and he said, "We don't respond to ignorance."
Oh, okay.
And and we rode away. And I think that is some of the best advice that I've ever gotten, that we don't respond to ignorance. And as I've grown older and wiser, I've learned that we do respond in situations where it's going to be conducive to be able to educate. But in that sense, in that instance, we don't respond to such ignorance did not yield an opportunity to educate and then to inform and for people to grow.
I think that's so key. I think as we live in this age now where people are trying to figure out, how do you respond? What do you say in those situations? And I don't think people truly know what to do. Responding with anger would have created a huge mess for you. So having that calm presence probably saved the situation.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Yeah. I wanted them to, get in their faces and say, "Don't you ever treat my son like this."
Yeah.
But that wasn't the best response at the time. Those responses have to be calculated and measured and weighed out.
Yeah, so I'm glad you kind of mentioned that, because I grew up in the Deep South, raised in Louisiana all my life. We had to learn, I guess, Dr. King's non-violent approach to conflict. because we were always outnumbered. If you had responded to something like that in Louisiana, when I grew up in the 60s, they may not ever find your body,
Right.
to be perfectly honest. So you really had
Right.
to just take a lot of stuff,
Yes.
and you had to take stuff and not respond back in a way that would have gotten you in trouble or get you killed.
Mm.
So can you kind of give me, I haven't lived in Louisiana for almost 30 years. What's the racial landscape like in Louisiana today?
You know, it's very interesting. You know, we are definitely a city that is a gumbo of many different peoples and languages, but also still very segregated. Even and I'll say not segregated as much as maybe classist. And I think Louisiana's, especially New Orleans, has always kind of been that way. That Black folks knew where they stood, white folks knew where they stood. You have the working class Black folks are serving the white folks. That ideology and that system kind of has never really ended. You see it quite evident here. You know, I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It was not that way. It wasn't this kind of old kind of antebellum understanding of, you know, they serve us, and even though, you know, they're not in the fields anymore here in Louisiana, it's still kind of that. There's this kind of undertone of that sort of mentality all the time, that the Black folks are working in the hotels, in the hospitality industry, serving in the restaurants, and never reaching that higher tier or upper echelon that the white community has.
Right. You know, in Louisiana, I don't know if it's still that way, but we were taught as African Americans, I don't know if it's just African American, but my grandparents always told me, you respond with yes, sir, and yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so even as I'm an adult, I have a hard time referring to someone who else is older than me without yes, ma'am, or yes, sir.
Yes.
It was kind of embedded in me in Louisiana that that's how you responded. I don't know if it was because of the racial divide or
Mm-hmm.
just a Southern greeting. So, you know, it's kind of things I grew up with.
Right. I wonder if that's, you know, more of a Southern thing, but you may be right too. It could go either way. You know, one incident I remember is when I first got here. I'm on the board of directors for an organization called Lighthouse of Louisiana, and the Lighthouse had a big event where it was at a mansion off of St. Charles Avenue, one of our only gated communities. Went to this event, Keith, and I showed up and went to the front door, and an African-American maid opened the door, and she escorted me back to the hall that everybody else was in, about 100 white folks, and I was the only Black person. All the servers were carrying these trays. In New Orleans, you get used to people carrying trays, serving appetizers, and they're all had these serving trays, and I'm standing there, and it was just the strangest, just uncomfortable experience watching them serve while I'm standing on the other side. And I felt people are looking at me like, not the white folks looking at me, but the Black folks looking at me like, how you get on this side?
Right.
Why don't you have a tray in your hand too? And I don't know if it was just me, but I definitely felt that way.
I would imagine, yeah. So what are the racial issues? You talked about the division, you know, the know your place kind of in New Orleans, but more of a class thing. But what are some of the racial issues that you're seeing in New Orleans today?
Right. You know, one of the big things that I'm working on, there's a couple of things that I'm working on presently. One that's been going on for years now is the removal of the Confederate monuments. And you being from Louisiana and knowing New Orleans, you know, we have a lot of Confederate monuments that were erected as result of white supremacy in the mid 1900s, and we've been consistently trying to remove them and rename streets, rename parks, rename different monuments so that they are no longer representing a stronghold of racism. So that and white supremacy, and that is one of the huge things that we're undergoing and that we've seen success in, but it kind of has come to a halt at the same time. And so that is an important project. And also too, in Louisiana, we are overwhelmed by petrochemical industries that have planted themselves for about 4 decades since the 1980s in historic, what I call communities of African African people who are slaves, African descendants of slaves, I like to say, ADOS. And these are, they planted these petrochemical industries on former plantations. They bought up this land, hundreds of acres, thousands of acres of former plantations, and now built these petrochemical industries that are absolutely poisoning these communities and driving them out because of, they've considered them sacrifice zones where they move in and say, well, we're going to consider these folks expendable and sacrificial so that we can make a major profit and off of the resources in this community because of the Gulf of Mexico and because of the Mississippi River and the large amounts of land that is available, and really profit off of this and poison the people with these horrible, harmful chemicals.
So you said two things that I want to drill a little deeper with, because I think from our audience who have these questions, these are important. Let's go back to the first point, the monuments to a bygone era. There's pushback on one side that would say, hey, we have to keep these Confederate flags and symbols up because they're a reminder of our history. Mm-hmm. So to those people who are pushing that philosophy, what would you say to say why this is not a good idea, or how it's harmful in Louisiana? Right.
It's harmful. And I think, first of all, when one of the major monuments that came down is Robert E. Lee. That was in the center of New Orleans, really, a place that we call Lee Circle because of Robert E. Lee. And, I think what people don't understand that while these monuments are a major part of history and a marker of what actually took place and are necessary for teaching, it is not necessary to give them prominent locations within our city. And I think that is why it's important for them to come down, because people don't need to realize that they are triggering mechanisms of trauma for people that for some, yes, it's a good indication of what has happened in history, but for others, it is also a triggering of a traumatic event that happened to our people as the African descendants of slaves that must come down. We just have to have a good conversation about where these monuments are appropriate to be. If you want them to continue to, if that's all your concern is their historical value, then let's put them let's buy out a 1,000 acres and make a huge park that is just Confederate Monument Park. And whenever you want to go there and you want to pay $20 to go take a tour, we'll give that $20 back to the African-American community somehow. But there's I think a logical place to put them, and they are not in the prominent places that allowed them to be erected because of white supremacy. And so that's, I think people have to understand what is historical to some is harmful to others.
That's probably the best explanation I've heard of the issue around that. People just kind of emotionally react to, you're taking away something from me, as opposed to understanding this. I thank you for that. That's a really good analogy for that. I think that park might not do well financially if money's going there, though. Just
we don't have to tell all of where the money is going.
Right. I don't think it's going to go well. Right. Now, the second part of that, I don't think people get either about the the environmental issues that drilling is causing in the Black community. Could you dig a little deeper for that? Because growing in Louisiana, I knew the Exxon refinery, and I knew the people who lived in those neighborhoods. I knew where they were at, like in Baton Rouge. And I also knew that we had a much higher cancer rate in those areas where the refineries were than other parts of Louisiana. So could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, first of all, that high cancer rate, within Louisiana, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, there is an area, an expanse that we call Cancer Alley. And it is because it has the highest rates of cancer. It may be in the top 5 by now, I'm not sure, but it's up there. It's not water too. It is up there as far as per capita incidents or occurrences of cancer. My group has renamed it Death Alley because we cannot just limit it to cancer. There are many other comorbidities that exist. People will have cancer, they'll have autoimmune disease, they'll have kidney failure, they'll diabetes. All of these things are represented within that area. And these areas are predominantly African-American people, the African descendants of slaves who live in these areas. And it is because, for example, we have in St. John the Baptist Parish, we have a chemical company called Denka. Denka produces chloroprene. Chloroprene is a byproduct of the production of neoprene that is used to manufacture such things as wetsuits, as computer sleeves, as koozies for your drinks. All of these things are used to chloroprene is used to as that byproduct. So, but chloroprene has been deemed by the EPA as being a substance that makes it nowhere, makes it safe, that is no, I'm gonna get this right, that is not safe as a byproduct to be produced anywhere. So as long as that byproduct is chloroprene, there's no safe place on earth for it to be emitted. And right now it's being emitted at a rate that is 400 times the EPA standard that is allowable, which is 0.25. And right now people are literally dying because of these emissions. And to add insult to injury, there is a school less than a mile away from this chemical company, or Dinka, and the school is right there, right on the fence line, where these children every day have to deal with inhaling this poison and are dealing with high rates of just severe asthma and can't go out to play. And so one of the things we've been advocating is that we would get this school moved, that these children, because we know that cancer has a 30-year incubation period, and we know that as the trends go in 30 years, we're going to find that all of these children who have been attending this elementary school are now suffering from cancer. As Christians, I believe that it is our call to protect our neighbors and do what we need to do to step in as good Samaritans and say we need to get the school moved, and we need for Dinka to fall in line with the EPA standards, and we need someone to hold them accountable for poisoning these children in this community in order that they might make a profit. And even too, during the pandemic, there is no need. And I've said this to representatives of our state and federal representatives, that there is no reason why a company such as Dinka should continue to be considered essential production during a pandemic. Shut it down, because during the pandemic, rates of the mortality and death rates went up even greater because they were exacerbated by the chemical production. So people were dying in St. John the Baptist Parish per capita at a rate greater than anywhere else in the nation. And we know science has proven that it was because of the petrochemical companies in this area.
Wow.
And let me say this, people need to hear about that. Out of sight, out of mind. I believe people in the Midwest, don't have any idea that people in these communities are literally being poisoned every day and are dying. We're talking elderly people, we're talking young people, and the whole excuse is, well, they bring jobs. They don't bring that many jobs, and the poor Black people aren't getting the jobs. That is a misconception and a myth that they're bringing that many jobs. And thirdly, we need to invest in green jobs, and our churches need to advocate for green jobs, because climate change is real.
Thank you, brother. That's deep. I don't think people really understood. If you don't grow up in that area, you don't get it. Much like people didn't get the pesticides issues with farming. If you don't live in a farming area, you don't understand how those pesticides can be dangerous too.
Right, right. It goes back to ignorance.
Right.
We just don't have the knowledge to make a correct assessment of the situation. And so we don't take the time to study. We don't take the time to listen. And so we don't increase and broaden our understanding of who really is in danger and who really needs us to advocate for them.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to get more personal now.
Sure.
So I think the perception I hear from a lot of white people is, racism isn't real. And Black people tend to maybe exaggerate how bad racism is. So on a personal level, can you just kind of share what has been your personal experience with racism, I would say outside the church and even inside the church?
First of all, I think, let me say that I think the reason why white people have the privilege, I'll say, to think that racism isn't real, because they've never had to deal with race. They've never had to deal with race as an essential component of their survival in the United States. And so, in some ways, it's understandable that they would be motivated by such understanding. For me, and you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
And so for me, I just really want for our white sisters to understand that when you have grown up and growing up in Fort Wayne, when you have grown up in such a place where, I remember walking into a grocery store with my grandmother, me and my cousins, and we were at that time maybe 3 or 4 years old, and walking into the grocery store and the manager following us around the store. And my grandmother stopped and going over to the man and say, "My grandchildren are not thieves. Would you please quit following them?" And he did, but it took her to stand up for us in that instance. That doesn't have, that's not a reality that white folks have to deal with. So they don't get that. But as a child, having that incident happen and knowing that it won't stop happening, from the time that I'm 5 years old walking to the store with my grandmother until the time that I'm now 47, it continues to happen. And so because it's not an aspect or reality in your world doesn't mean that it is not happening. And just because your friends don't talk about it amongst you regarding white folks, I don't think they're going to share with you what they did or what they perpetrated or that incident to that manager. He didn't go home and tell his family, "Oh, guess what? This one," it was of no consequence to him. But
Right.
To me, family and my grandmother, it was, just as, I was pastor in Kansas City, Kansas for 10 years. When I got to my Lutheran church in Kansas City, Kansas in 2001, Keith, they handed me 2 lists of shut-ins. They said, "Here's the list of shut-ins that you can visit." 2001. "Here's a list of shut-ins that we're going to have someone else visit because they will not receive communion from a Black man's hands." And I go, "Okay, I'm going to go on with my call here and hope that I can make change." And that's what we do as Black people. A lot of times we just go on. We don't. What white people need to understand is that we don't get up, and when a racial incident happens that is an aggression against us, we don't get up and say, "Everybody stop, hold on, let me tell you what just happened to me."
Right.
We keep on with the flow. We keep rolling with the punches and advocate for change when we can, as we listen to God in his direction. And I don't think people get that just because you don't notice it, just because we don't make a big deal about it, because we've gotten used to it and we've learned how to maneuver and navigate such situations, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen.
Right. The other part of that is, I think somebody, and I was talking to another person on my interview, and they said, we're just tired of having to talk about race. And, I think he made a good point. You're right. We don't talk about every single incident of racism because we're just sick of having the conversation.
Right.
Because we hope that people will listen, that they will stop and try and make a change, but we've just given up on the possibility that we're going to have a fruitful conversation about race with somebody who's of a different race than us, because they just won't get it. And so I think he said something really really critical to me. It's like, I'll give you one chance. I'll share my story with you one time. If you respond the wrong way, I'm done talking to you about it because it's a waste of my time now.
Right, right. And that is so true, Keith. I've been engaged in a conversation with two fraternity brothers, one black and one white. And we were having a group text conversation where, he's come a long way, granted, because when we were in college, he was very racist when we first entered as freshmen. And then we became best friends by the end of, by the middle of our freshman year. He was taking me home to visit his family, and, that became great. But there's still a lot that he just doesn't get. And so in our text conversation, my one fraternity brother finally texted me privately and said, you need to stop wasting your breath. You need to stop allowing him to consume you with this conversation, because he's just not going to get it. And I think, we have to be introspective on ourselves and really understand that we're to put our energy and we're not to put our energy while trying to not trying to survive, and while trying to make sure that our families are provided for and protected. And so the conversation that is about racism is maybe more beneficial for white folks to have for themselves and get knowledgeable than for us to constantly give our time to trying to elevate them in terms of what racism really is. There's a whole lot of self-teaching that they can do on their own.
Right. And I think I did this podcast because I think we are kind of tired of having the conversation, but hopefully by peeling back the wall of what we go through, that as they hear this conversation, they will begin to understand at least a little bit of what it's like. Because you really can't truly get it unless you walk every day in this skin and walk on this earth with all the things going on around us.
Yes. Yes.
I want to give you a platform to speak to the church. If you could tell the church some practical things that they can do to begin to heal the racial divide in America, what would you tell them? Here's your chance. You get the stump for a while here. Go ahead.
The church, I'm part of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I think there's first realizing who we are. The church has to take and do a very realistic assessment of who we are as a church, and not kid ourselves about that, but be very open-minded in terms of saying, okay, look, for the Lutheran Church for over 150 years, we've managed to stay 98% white, if not more. Those numbers are real. I think they're more like 99% white. Let's take a correct assessment and to ask ourselves why, and to see what we do to be complicit in the maintaining of that very stark and very really just astonishing statistic. What do we do to embrace that? And I think to do certain things like, at my church, we offer what are called Undoing Racism conferences. And one of the groups that we've had the privilege of working with is what's called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And anyone can look them up, the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And they'll come in and they'll lead what's called an Undoing Racism conference, where Black and white people sit down together and really have some very open conversation about what racism is. And it's a kind of a 2.5 day workshop, and people come away with a renewed understanding of correct vocabulary in terms of race, and how all of us participate in racism, and what role we play in it. And so that is one of the things I advocate for. And secondly is to really be about having these conversations amongst themselves, and to really advocating for books to be read, for seminars to be had, and to not let the influence of money get in the way of conversations. I've seen that happen. Pastors and churches don't even want to broach the conversation about race because they're afraid that they're going to lose congregants. I don't believe that's the will of God, that we don't want to introduce the conversation, or we don't want to talk with our neighbor about what's hurting them, and what's causing them pain and suffering, and to feel unloved because we're afraid that we're going to lose dollars in the offering plate. I do not believe that's the will of God. And so we have to remove that from our evaluation and whether we enter into the discussion or not. I've had a pastor friend who really embraced that his congregation is predominantly white, if not all white, would read a book about justice. It's called the Social Justice Bible that I was promoting. Great book. And incidentally, I don't believe in social justice. I just believe in justice, according to Micah 6:8. What does God require? Do just love mercy and walk humbly with our God. But he advocated for reading of this book. He had parishioners actually leave who were huge donors, huge givers. And I said, do you regret that you advocated and supported people reading this book? And he goes, not at all. He said, I just regret that I didn't do it sooner. He says, I know that God will provide. And I commend him. I am so proud of him for that, because if all of us did that, if every church said, we're going to go down this road of having this conversation, and if you want to get up and take your money with you and your mindset with you, then there is the door. Keep on moving, because this is the day and the time where we need to have this conversation if we're truly going to be representative of the church of God that he has called us to be, a church that protects our neighbor, that loves our neighbor as ourselves. Then we have to do that. So I think pastors really need to start preaching it from the pulpit. Need to start talking about America's sin of racism, that many sitting in the pews each day are complicit in allowing to be very pervasive within our nation, because to remain silent about it is to also be complicit in the behavior. And so we need to not be afraid of that conversation. And I think thirdly, and I'll end here, I think is to look for ways in which we can get involved. There are many organizations out there that are working for justice, to eliminate disparities, to bring about and to fight against injustices, just as my organization, the Coalition Against Death Alley, that I'm a part of. Get involved. Find those organizations that are out there doing the work. It's fine to serve at a food pantry. That helps with the elimination of people who are food insecure and living in food deserts. But also there are many, many, many areas to get involved in, and many organizations. Do the research to find out where they are in your community. Step out of your comfort zone and be willing to listen and to learn and to participate in dismantling racism wherever you're located geographically.
Amen, brother. So where can my listeners find you on social media, if you want them to find you?
Yeah. That's want them to find me. Look me up, Gregory T. Manning on social media. You'll find me wearing a blue bow tie and a blue suit. And so Gregory T. Manning on social media. You can look up the Coalition Against Death Alley.org or enddeathalley.org. You can also look that up on Facebook. It's Coalition Against Death Alley. So you can look me up at BroadmoorCommunityChurch.org too, to find me there at my church. You can also look up the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition, GNOICC.org, the Greater New Orleans Interfaith Climate Coalition, where we educate clergy about climate justice and environmental justice and how they can work towards that as well too. So feel free to contact me anytime. gmanning1973@yahoo.com. Would love to hear from you.
Thank you, brother. I really appreciate this time, and I really pray that we keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. It's been an honor, Keith. Thank you.
Thank you. For my listeners, I want to thank you for taking this time as we keep talking about how we can move forward as a people of God. Even those on the outside who just want to know, what can I do to make a difference? If you've been impacted by the George Floyd incident and it really got you thinking, what can I do to make a difference? I pray that you follow this podcast and share it with your friends, because we are really having some great conversations, and we're starting to get people really thinking about how in the world can God use me to bring about racial healing. You can find my podcast on all the major outlets: Apple, iTunes, Google Podcasts. It's also on Amazon Music. I invite you to take this and share this with your friends. I'm having a special offer this month for the best review left on any of those platforms. You get a signed copy of my new book, Words of Comfort. It's a collaboration of devotions for young people coming up. You can also follow my blog on The Light Breaks Through at www.alightbreakthrough.org and share similar content and get this podcast sent right to your email box. May God bless you as you continue to be the voice of reconciliation in your community and in your neighborhood.